Welcome back to the MMA Plug, presented to you by the Fan Cave on 98.1 FM, Mile High Sports Radio. I'm your host, Jordan Kurtz. You can give me a follow along online at Comments from the Peanut Gallery. We're going to take a look at a few cards throughout UFC history, or a few fights throughout UFC history that have been historic, given that this weekend is that 30th anniversary show that'll be going down at Madison Square Garden. We're looking specifically at the top 5 Madison Square Garden moments here. Keep in mind, MMA was banned in New York from 1997 until 2016. They needed to basically say that, you know what, this has been the fight mecca throughout the ages. Everything from the fight of the century with guys like Muhammad Ali, guys like Tyson, all of these historic names in boxing were able to fight there through the years. This is the mecca of events. This is the Big Apple. This is New York. This is Madison Square Garden, ladies and gentlemen. The biggest stage in the entertainment world. Coming in at number 5 on the list, we have Jorge Masvidal taking on Nate Diaz for the inaugural BMF title. Now, obviously, the doctor spoiled the party for everybody. It was unfortunate that the fight had to be stopped due to a cut in a contest that was billed as the baddest MFer out there in the game. If this were in a different state, highly likely that the fight would have been allowed to continue. But I digress. In this matchup, you had tremendous amount of buildup. Nate Diaz was fresh off of that victory from Anthony Pettis at UFC 241, where he cut the infamous, yeah, he's a gangster, but he ain't no West Coast gangster promo, with Jorge Masvidal sitting there cage side in the crowd. Jorge was on that meteoric rise. They go into that contest. You have the ultimate buildup. The UFC created a belt for this fight. You have The Rock as a part of it. Just so much of a spectacle put in place and put forth for this matchup between two of the tried and true OGs of the fight game. So that's why, for me, even though that fight was spoiled prematurely due to the doctor, that's why that ends up on my list. That's number 5 there. Coming in at number 4 is last year's UFC 281. Headlined on the card, you have Alex Pereira, you have Poatan knocking out Israel the Last Stylebender Adesanya to win that UFC middleweight championship. This, at that stage, marked 3-0 in fights for Poatan against Stylebender. That was his second win via knockout against him. That was historic. You know, obviously, Pereira was fast-tracked to that UFC title shot because of the rivalry that he had with Adesanya. He wouldn't have made that rise that fast without having that connection, but he showed that, you know what, the hype is real. Like, I am that guy. I'm going to come in here, and now what has been the sport that he has dominated for the last few years. Izzy was one of the most active and dominant champions at middleweight, the most dominant champion at middleweight outside of Anderson Silva. Alex Pereira comes in, gets the win by knockout. He makes history right there with that, and you saw a tremendous amount of other fights and matchups on that card that were just totally worth the price of admission, worth the price of the pay-per-view buy. You have Chris Gutierrez, our friend of the show here, El Guapo retiring Frankie Edgar. You had Dustin Poirier submitting Michael Chandler. That's when the Money Moicano persona came to life after Renato Moicano submitted Brad Riddell. Ryan Spann presumably retired, friend of the show, and Dominic Reyes with that jab. And then you had Erin Blanchfield in front of her hometown crowd derailing the hype train of Molly Meatball McCann. So there was a lot of fights that were definitely worth noting there on that UFC 281 card last year at Madison Square Garden. At UFC 268, that was a great night for Trevor Whitman and company. Very rarely do you see the main 3 names or the main 3 matchups on a fight all come from the same camp or have the same coach within them. 2 of those fights being sitting champions. You had Kamaru Usman defeating Colby Covington in the main event to retain his welterweight title. You had Rose Namajunas defeating Zhang Weili for the second time to retain her strawweight title. And then you had Justin the Highlight Gaethje taking on Iron Michael Chandler in what became the 2021 Fight of the Year. So between those three alone, I mean, what a tremendous night for the Onyx brand, for Trevor Whitman and crew. Like we say, that's three massive fights. I mean, three in terms of the game planning for those top tier opponents. That's a complete just boggling of the mind that he was able to compartmentalize and engage for those three high level bouts themselves right there on that card. But then also on the night, we saw a plethora of other names that just pop right off the screen as soon or now will ring throughout your ears as soon as I say them. Also on that card, you had Alex Pereira. That was his UFC debut. Dustin Jacoby, now top 15 light heavyweight. You had Cheeto versus Frankie. You had Chris Barnett's wheel kick against Gian Vellante. You had Bobby Green sending Ally Quinta into retirement. Chris Curtis countering Phil Haas' head into oblivion. That fight delivered top to bottom. That was one of the top cards of the year. And like I say, that was a tremendous night of action there in the octagon for UFC 268. Coming in at number 2, UFC 217. This was an event that had a tremendous amount of hype behind it because of some of the historical significance to it. You had George St. Pierre returning after a multi-year layoff. He comes into that contest and defeats Michael Bisping and becomes a middleweight champion after he had that Hall of Fame GOAT run as the welterweight champion. That was a big moment simply because George St. Pierre was, or still is, thought of by many as one of, if not the GOATs of the sport. Comes in and cements that legacy after a multi-year layoff by capturing a championship in a different division, going up and being the smaller man. You had the infamous Thug Rose moment, probably the best call and one of the few bright moments that DC's ever had on the call. But you had Thug Rose Namajunas upsetting the Boogie Woman Joanna Jędrzejczyk with that knockout victory. That cemented Rose in the all-time great status right there, or that put her on the pedestal for that opportunity. She goes out there, she wins in the rematch against Joanna, then goes out and beats Weili twice. It's hard to say that Rose Namajunas is not the women's strawweight GOAT. Her only kryptonite has been Carla Esparza. Aside from that, like I say, against the most highly heralded champions that others speak about in the strawweight division, she has a collective 4-0 record against them. So to me, any argument against Thug Rose Namajunas being the women's strawweight GOAT is null and void, and it started that night at UFC 217. You also had the highly controversial, bitter vitriol-fueled grudge match between TJ Dillashaw and Cody No Love Garbrandt. This was a barn burner that had Cody had 5 more seconds in the first round, arguably finishes that fight. In the second round, TJ recovers right away. Somehow, in a EPO-fueled recovery, manages to regain all of his composure, his mentals, his breath, and processes the intel to find the head kick knockout in that second round. Again, very controversial. There was a lot of build up to that fight, being that they were former teammates. The entire separation from Team Alpha Male that TJ had. They had a full season of The Ultimate Fighter to build up this rivalry and this beef between them. Full press conference tours where they're going at it back and forth. So that was UFC 217, and why that comes in at number 2 on the list. Rounding this off, starting it all for the UFC at Madison Square Garden, that's UFC 205. I'm sure that this comes as no surprise to anybody that this is the top one on the list. UFC 205. Again, this 2016 card was monumental in history because New York was the 50th state to legalize mixed martial arts after having it banned in 1997. This card was stacked with a lot of the stars of that day and era, which you can still recognize their name value today. This card was loaded with people like Chris Weidman and Yoel Romero, Misha Tate and Raquel Pennington, Habib Nurmagomedov and Frankie Edgar. You had Wonderboy Thompson, Tyron Woodley, Jeremy Stevens, Ioana Jędrzejczyk, Jim Miller. All of these names were all huge to put on this card, but they capitalized on the moment by putting the biggest star that the sport has ever seen on the biggest, most historic fighting stage possible. Now, not only did Conor McGregor versus Eddie Alvarez deliver in the cage, it also delivered as a commercial success with a $17+ million gate, along with a top 10 placing, 1.3 million pay-per-view buy rate. This was a smashing success of a card. That was Conor's godlike performance, if you will, to become a double champ against the undeniable great like Eddie Alvarez, who's literally been a world champion in every major organization that he has gone and fought for. Eddie Alvarez still right now, Underground King. He's going out there to fight Mike Platinum Perry in bare knuckle fighting to see who's going to be one of the baddest dogs out there on the planet in just pure raw fisticuffs there. So, like we say, you can't have a list of the top UFC moments at Madison Square Garden without having Conor McGregor and Eddie Alvarez at UFC 205. That's even spurned the opening line of Tory Lane's song, Stupid Again. The double champ does what he wants. You all know what those lines are, and just some of the iconic sound bites that came from Conor. That era of Conor McGregor.
I'd like to take this chance to apologize to absolutely nobody. The double champ does what the he wants.
And right on cue, my man Danny Bailey hits us off with that. Stick around after the break, folks. We're going to be going 3 rounds to close out the hour. This is the MMA Plug presented to you by the Fan Cave on 98.1 FM, Mile High Sports Radio.
Thank you so much for watching. Please hit that like, share, and subscribe button. That helps us continue to produce this original MMA content and bring it for you every single week. Tune in to the MMA Plug presented by Fan Cave on 98.1 FM, Mile High Sports Radio.